Hello, my name is Jeremy Gully and I'm the chairman of Bembridge Harbour Trust. We're a charitable organisation that looks to see Bembridge Harbour managed sustainably and lawfully, so it provides the facility the community relies upon into the future. The harbour has some significant problems, not least amongst them is the rate of siltation. And we look at this and other infrastructure issues and the sort of causes and the sort of remedies that we try and apply to see the harbour best managed in the interests of the community. So, rise the problems. There is accelerating siltation. We need to know what causes it. There are failures to manage and maintain. What can be done about it, and how can that be paid for? Because after all, no maintenance is free. First, let's look at a slide from a paper by Charlie White of Portsmouth University. This shows the progressive erosion of Bembridge Point and the progressive closure of the harbour entrance if nothing is done. The pink line shows the situation in 50 years, which theoretically would show the harbour being closed off completely. This of course won't happen, because the river will find some form of route for exhaust, and needless to say, someone will do some dredging. But if you have a look here at this yellow line in 25 years, you'll see that this pool is closed off. That's pretty important, because if this pool is closed off, this beach will join this sandbank very quickly, and the circular flow around the sandbank that keeps open Selwyn's pontoon, the Red Wing Quay and Bembridge Sailing Club's facilities will soon become silted up. If we look at this pool here specifically, here is a plot of survey measurements from two surveys only 10 months apart in 2020-2021. If you have a look here, you'll see there's an increase in siltation of over a metre in just that 10 months. That is pretty frightening of itself, but all the more so when you look at the whole of this area, the area dredged for that those moorings, that this is silting at a rate of about 2.5 times that which it did only 10 or 15 years ago. And just south of that pool is the central sandbank. And these plots, this is from Channel Coastal Observatory, this shows the growth on the sandbank is pretty dramatic. Not only is it growing upwards, it's growing sideways, and you can see here the very significant reduction in depth in the harbour to the west of the sandbank as it goes past the, or towards the 4.5 moorings, and of course Fisherman's Pontoon that has not been dredged since 2004. This rate of accretion is really quite dramatic. And if you look at this graph, this is plots of the height of the sandbank, and you will see that in this location, extrapolated, it suggests that by around 2034, the sandbank will actually be dry at high neap tides. That's no water, no navigability at high tide. Obviously in spring tides there'll be a bit more water, but still that area are pretty useless for navigation and of course pretty useless for commercial moorings. So is this an avoidable situation? Is this siltation avoidable? And what's causing it? Well, one of the fundamental issues, one of the fundamental tools available to slow the rate of accretion is Bembridge Point groin. It was originally put there around the 1900s as a physical obstacle. It's an obstacle to longshore drift, that's material coming along the beach from wave action, and also as a training wall, that is to concentrate, focus and therefore speed the ebb flows out of the harbour to help scour the channel. It's now in total disrepair. So there's nothing to obstruct the 5,000 to 10,000 cubic metres of material that will come along here and round the corner and into the harbour if it's not dealt with. The movement offshore is even greater. There's between 20 and 40,000 cubic metres passes between this point and St Helens Fort on its way northeastwards, and that's reported in various scientific papers on the subject. Unfortunately, promises go unfulfilled. We were told that this last autumn the groin would be addressed. We were told that Atros Point, that you saw in Charlie White's illustration, was growing. We were told that would be dredged. It hasn't been. We were told the piles at Bembridge Marina would be properly repaired. We haven't seen that. We have seen some things that should be entirely positive, but unfortunately haven't been. New contractors have taken over from H.J. Bennett's, who used to occupy this area and dredge the channel. Bennett's used to pay £32,000 a year for the privilege of extracting shingle. We don't know what the commercial terms are, but clearly there is a relationship between the contractors and the management of the harbour and landowner here. And it's a pity that the management control is not helping the harbour so much as it could do. For instance, this red area here is being used for gravel mining. This is well outside the channel and outside the area that's allowed to be dug under a formal protocol between the Isle of Wight Council, Natural England and the Harbour Authority. It wouldn't matter if it didn't matter, but it does matter. Dredging here helps divert flows, split the ebb flow. Now the useful ebb flow going down the channel helps scour, maintain and keep that channel open. But if you divert it, you create a dummy channel here, and that's what's happening. It ends in a new bar here, and the energy that should be helping keep the exit channel clear is being split and largely wasted. Also, soft material dug out of here is being piled up around the yard because of course this area is otherwise being eroded. You again saw that in Charlie White's paper. The reason it's being eroded is because this groin is missing, so there is nothing making a build up here to prevent that erosion of the shoreline. The problem is if you build up soft material here, come the next high spring tide with some wind, this material simply comes round into the harbour, and of course once in the harbour, if it is possible, it's expensive to remove. I mentioned the piles that needed repair. This isn't a current picture, so there has been some work since then, but this illustrates the situation when a boat called Tangent was sunk. And it was sunk in this marina because a pile guide like this got trapped into a hole like this, meaning that the pontoon was penned down on a rising tide, and that held down a boat that was moored to it, and it sank. It was a total loss, and the cost to the harbour or the harbour and their insurers was very high. It went to the High Court, and the judge ruled that the harbour had failed in its duties to maintain infrastructure. So what can be done about this sort of situation? Well, it is a question of following the money, because as we've said, you can't maintain without money. And for an understanding of that, you need to consider the corporate structure of the companies around the harbour and also the framework of legislation that governs its management. So the company that's important is Bembridge Harbour Improvement Company Limited. That is the statutory harbour authority. It has a duty in law to do various things. It has a duty to manage in the public interest and to employ its incomes for the betterment of the harbour. What it can't do, but is doing, is use money for non-harbour purposes, or at least that's what it appears to be doing. It's lending large amounts of money to Bembridge Investments Limited. This, of course, isn't the harbour company, it's a completely separate property company. It's lending money to Bembridge Boat Storage. This isn't the harbour company, it's a completely separate corporate entity owned, I think now, just by Mr. Thorpe, but under the umbrella of the Thorpe family. Money goes to Hawke Property Development. Rather mysteriously, some is for rent, but it's rent for Bembridge Investments land. Some is paid to Hawke for management, and some is paid for Hawke for interest. This is interest on a large loan from Hawke to Bembridge Harbour Improvements Company Limited. But this is not a loan that facilitates improvement in the harbour. This was a loan that effectively was funding the purchase of Bembridge Harbour Improvements Company Limited by Hawke. And what's been happening since then, in effect, is that Bembridge Harbour Improvements Company have been paying the cost of its own purchase. These interest payments are not going towards improvement. The advice we have is that this is likely to be unlawful and because it's in conflict with the Local Harbour Act. So what we've got is money going from one company to another company, some coming back, some coming to another company. It is very difficult to follow. There are opaque intercompany loan accounts. It's very unfortunate these are opaque because Port's good governance guidance issued by the government to all statutory harbour authorities, whether private or otherwise, is that they should manage in the broad public interest and with reasonable openness. Now there's another way that you can raise money, and there was a proposal by Bembridge Investments Limited to carry out a residential development to produce profits for improvements in the harbour. That occupied two sites, or would occupy two sites. This is the Dover site. And outlined in red is the area that the harbour users and visitors get to use and enjoy at the moment. So parties happen here, entertainment happens here, shops, offices, wash facilities, good bit of parking. That's how it is at the moment. But if the development progresses, you'll see that all this land is lost to residential. In fact, the only land that's assured for the harbour company is this blue land. And if you have a look here, you'll see there's just 8 visitor car parking spaces. Remembering this marina has 140 berths, and also that around 64.5 berths are serviced from here, this provision of car parking seems totally inadequate. That said, it's not quite as bad as the proposals at Bembridge Marina, where there'd be no shoreside parking, no harbourside parking, just one drop-off space, and the parking is displaced to a more remote location. Returning back to the Dover, the entertainment that gets offered here, which is a unique selling point and attracts visitors to the harbour, is going to be surely severely restricted. The only area that could be used is this, and it's not assured to the harbour at all. It is only at the generosity of the developer. And bearing in mind that these owners, likely retired or second homers, have got access over this land, there clearly is a conflict between the continued use of this area for entertainment and these houses. There's a further complication, and that is on land ownership. The area we identify here in pale red, according to land registry plans for both Bembridge Harbour Improvement Company and Bembridge Investments Limited, belongs to the harbour. According to letter from land registry and a court case where the harbour company itself challenged the previous owners of this land and made sure this red land stayed in the harbour's ownership following the correct line of high water. Despite that, Mr. Thorpe, wearing Bembridge Investments Limited, that's the developer's hat, claims this pink land belongs to the developer already. Now, the implications for the harbour are fairly obvious. It doesn't get reward for land. If this is its land, it should surely get reward for it. And even more absurdly, it will be asked to pay rent for its own land and buildings built upon its own land without any compensation. In short, the harbour doesn't receive benefit from the development that we think it should. Also, be clear, this development produces no income for the Harbour Authority to address issues like the groin, dredging or those piles. All of the predicted income goes to the development company and stays with the development company. The harbour is left having to pay market rent for these newer but slightly smaller facilities. And if the harbour is paying a developer market rent for these new facilities, it seems that the developer could have built them and funded on that rental stream. The houses do not seem to have been necessary. So these are the sort of issues that cause us concern. There is money going to other companies. There are development proposals that appear to harm the interests of the harbour and don't see it properly compensated. And if that continues, the harbour is likely to decline further. It's true that the visitor to the harbour has seen their marina dredged. The company Bembridge Boat Storage has seen its access dredged. So some work gets done, but it doesn't address the fundamental wide problems of the harbour user, like for instance the commercial fisherman, whose tidal window is reduced as their berths have not been dredged since 2004. Now, lots of organisations have tried to do things about this. So, firstly, Bembridge and St Helens Harbour Association, then Bembridge Harbour User Group, that's BHUG. They spent 5 years trying to get that groin repaired. And they weren't asking the harbour for lots of money, they were going to publicly fund the repair of that groin. But the prevarication of the Statutory Harbour Authority led to incredible frustration. Ultimately, they gave up on that project. The Bembridge Harbour Advisory Group, that's the Harbour Authority's own advisory group, chaired by Mr Thorpe, put forward proposals where the concerns about money the Bembridge Harbour Trust have could be looked at. And whilst that was initially progressed, as soon as it got down to nitty-gritty and an independent review, the Statutory Harbour Authority's directors withdrew from that process. Sadly, that's meant we're left with what is a last resort, and that's going to law. So we're progressing 2 judicial reviews. One is of the Statutory Harbour Authority, and that's to try and recover immediately well over £500,000 so that it has more money to maintain itself. And in the longer term, there are far larger sums than that concern us. So ultimately, we may be looking at something more like between £1.5 and £2 million. We also have a judicial review that's in limbo at the moment, subject to the Court of Appeal, but a judicial review of the Isle of Wight Council for the decision to grant planning for those houses that we don't think were necessary. And that's been made all the more obvious now by delayed accounts, but from the period before the planning was issued, showing that the harbour did in fact have substantial amounts of money, but had chosen to lend them to others. So these are the sort of issues we address. It's quite expensive to do so, it's very occupying to do so in terms of time, and we need support. So in an ideal world, we'd love you to donate. And you could do that by going to our website, and it's on the bank details are on the homepage. Alternatively, you may look at this and feel you have other solutions to offer, or that our approach is wrong. If that's the case, we still would very much like to hear from you, because We've got to work for the betterment of the harbour in the interests of the community. There is no other correct objective. Thank you for listening.